February 28th, 2026. 60 minutes. That is how long it took to erase the entire senior military command of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The supreme leader, dead. Every general of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, dead. The architects of 30 years of proxy warfare across the Middle East, buried under the rubble of a single compound in Tehran. The operation struck more than 30 aim points simultaneously. It knew exactly where every person would be. Not approximately, not in general terms. Exactly. The world spent the next 48 hours asking one question. How did Israel know? How does any intelligence service reach that deep into the most protected command structure in the Middle East? Not once, but operation after operation, year after year, each strike more precise than the last. And why, in the days that followed, did Iran say almost nothing? No explanation, no named culprit, just silence. There is an answer. It is not classified.
It is not a theory. It was spoken out loud, on camera, by a former president of Iran himself, more than a year before the bombs fell. And what he described is one of the most extraordinary intelligence penetrations in the history of modern espionage. Iran built a special unit to hunt Mossad agents operating inside the country. A dedicated, highly classified team, its sole purpose to find Israeli spies and eliminate them. The man who ran that unit turned out to be a Mossad agent himself. So did 20 of his operatives. Every single one of them. The hunters were the hunted. And by the time Tehran figured that out, they were already gone. If you want to understand how Israel dismantled the most dangerous intelligence apparatus in the Middle East from the inside, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover the operations the world is still trying to explain. New video every day. But to understand what happened on February 28th, 2026, you have to go back, not to the strike itself, not even to the months of planning that preceded it. You have to go back to the moment when Iran looked at what Mossad was doing inside its borders and made a decision that would ultimately cost it everything. By the mid-2000s, Israel's intelligence operations inside Iran had reached a scale that Iranian security services could no longer explain away. It was not just the nuclear scientists, it was the pattern. Beginning in 2007 with the death of nuclear physicist Ardashir Hosseimpour, initially attributed to a gas leak, later assessed by multiple intelligence analysts as a Mossad operation, a systematic campaign of targeted killings had begun working its way through the Iranian nuclear establishment. Each operation was precise. Each one demonstrated knowledge that could only come from deep inside the Iranian system. Someone was telling the Israelis who to target, where to find them, and when they would be vulnerable. Inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the question was not whether Mossad had penetrated Iranian institutions. That was no longer seriously in dispute. The question was how deeply and where. The IRGC's intelligence arm and Iran's Ministry of Intelligence, two separate and frequently competing bureaucracies, each with its own networks, its own methods, and its own institutional pride, both understood that something had gone badly wrong. Iranian agents were being rolled up. Operations were being compromised. Men who should have been untouchable were dying on Iranian streets in broad daylight. The response, as it took shape in the years following 2007, was institutional. Iran would build something new, not simply a counterintelligence department within the existing structure. Those had already been penetrated, or at least that was the working assumption. What was needed was a dedicated unit, separate from the existing chains of command, with its own access and its own mandate. A team whose entire purpose was to find Mossad's agents inside Iran and eliminate them before they could do further damage. Highly classified, tightly compartmented, access restricted to an absolute minimum of personnel. The logic was sound. The execution was catastrophic. Because the most important decision in building any new intelligence unit is not its structure, its budget, or its mandate.
It is the choice of who runs it. And the man chosen to lead Iran's new anti-Mossad unit, the man given access to the most sensitive counterintelligence files in the Islamic Republic, the man who would know the identities of every suspected Israeli asset, every compromised channel, every weak point in the Iranian security architecture, was already working for the other side. This is not speculation.
This is not an analytical conclusion drawn from pattern analysis or circumstantial evidence. This is what Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, who held office from 2005 to 2013, stated directly and on the record in an interview with CNN Turk in October of 2024. His words were unambiguous. Iran established a unit to counter Mossad operations inside the country. The man who headed that unit was an Israeli agent, and he was not alone. 20 additional members of that same unit were also working for Mossad. Ahmadinejad is a complicated figure. His tenure as president was marked by confrontation, by the violent suppression of the 2009 protests that followed his disputed re-election, and by a brand of populist politics that made him enemies across Iran's factional landscape. He is not a neutral witness, and he is not a reliable one on every subject.
But on this specific claim, the penetration of the anti-Mossad unit, he was not speaking as a politician making a partisan argument. He was speaking as a former head of state describing a security failure so severe that it had, in his assessment, shaped every major intelligence disaster Iran had suffered in the decade that followed. And critically, no Iranian official publicly denied it. In a system that reflexively contests any narrative that makes the Islamic Republic look weak, the silence around Ahmadinejad's claim was itself a form of confirmation. The unit, by design, sat at the intersection of everything Iran most needed to protect. Its personnel would have had visibility into ongoing counterintelligence investigations. They would have known which Iranian officials were under suspicion of foreign contact.
They would have known the technical methods Iran used to detect surveillance, the human methods it used to identify informants, and the procedural methods it used to verify loyalty. They would have known, in short, exactly what an Israeli intelligence service would need to know in order to operate inside Iran without being caught. And the man at the top of that structure, the man with the broadest access and the deepest visibility, was feeding all of it to the enemy. Consider what that means in practice. Every time Iranian counterintelligence got close to a real Mossad asset, the unit's commander knew about it. Every time a surveillance operation began to narrow in on a genuine lead, that information passed through a channel that ran directly to Tel Aviv. Every name that appeared in an investigation file, every technical method that was deployed, every procedural step that Iran's security services took to protect their most sensitive operations. All of it was visible to a man who was reporting it to the other side. It was not simply that Iran failed to find Mossad's agents. It was that Iran's best tool for finding them was itself the problem. The search was being conducted by the spy. How long this had been going on, Ahmadinejad did not specify. When exactly the recruitment had occurred, which service had run the operation, what the precise mechanism of contact had been. None of this was disclosed. What was disclosed was the endpoint. The unit head was identified as a double agent in 2021. And by the time that identification was made, he and all 20 of his operatives had already left Iran. They were living in Israel. Every single one of them had gotten out before the net closed. That detail, the timing of the escape, is not a footnote. It is the center of the story. Because it means that the moment Iranian counterintelligence got close enough to the truth to act on it, someone knew. Someone inside the system knew that the investigation had reached a critical point, and the entire network evacuated before a single arrest could be made. Which raises a question that Ahmadinejad did not answer, and that Iranian authorities have never answered publicly. Who warned them? His name has never been published,
not by Ahmadinejad, who described him only in functional terms, not by any Iranian official who have maintained an absolute public silence on his identity, not by any Western intelligence source who are not in the business of confirming the names of people who are presumably still alive and still useful. The man who ran Iran's anti-Mossad unit is known to the Iranian security services, known to Mossad, and known to no one else.
He is the most consequential unnamed figure in the intelligence history of this conflict. And the fact that his name has been so thoroughly suppressed, on both sides, tells you something important about how seriously both sides regard what he knew. The answer to what he took with him points back into the Iranian system itself, into a layer of penetration that did not end with the escape of 21 men to Israel. It points towards something that was still running, still in place, still invisible to the people tasked with finding it. And that is exactly where this story goes next. To understand what 21 men carried out of Iran in 2021, you have to understand what their jobs had given them access to. The unit commander and his 20 operatives were not peripheral figures in the Iranian security apparatus. They were not clerks or administrators with incidental access to sensitive files. They were the people whose specific professional purpose was to map the full extent of Mossad's presence inside Iran. To do that job, they needed to know everything. And so they did. They knew the identities of every Iranian official who had come under suspicion of foreign contact, everyone who had been flagged, everyone who had been investigated, everyone who had been cleared. They knew which surveillance methods the IRGC used to monitor its own personnel. They knew which communication channels were considered secure and which had already been compromised. They knew the procedural logic of Iranian counterintelligence from the inside out, not as an abstraction, but as a living operational system with specific weaknesses, specific blind spots, and specific gaps that a foreign intelligence service could exploit without ever being detected. When those 21 men arrived in Israel, they did not simply bring files. They brought a complete operational map of how Iran looks for spies. And that map was worth more than any individual piece of intelligence they could have carried. Because it did not just tell Mossad what Iran knew. It told Mossad exactly where Iran would never look. The implications of that transfer took time to fully materialize. Intelligence services do not immediately deploy everything a new source provides. They analyze, they verify, they build new operational frameworks around the knowledge they have acquired, carefully, so that the knowledge itself is not exposed by the operations it enables. But in the years between 2021 and 2026, the results of what those 21 men brought with them became visible. Operation by operation, strike by strike, in a sequence of events that Iranian officials would later describe as a catastrophe without precedent in the history of the Islamic Republic. But first, it is essential to understand what had already been possible while the unit's commander was still in place, still sitting inside Tehran, still drawing a salary from the Islamic Republic, and still reporting everything he learned to the other side. The first demonstration came not with a killing, but with a theft. And not just any theft. The most audacious intelligence operation conducted on Iranian soil in the modern era. On the night of January 31st, 2018, 3 years before the unit's exposure, at a time when its commander was still fully operational and still providing Mossad with a continuous map of Iranian counterintelligence, fewer than 24 Mossad agents entered a warehouse in the Shorabad industrial district of southern Tehran. The warehouse was unremarkable from the outside. It looked like a storage facility for a light industrial operation, located in a neighborhood where no one would notice unusual activity. That was precisely why the Iranian Ministry of Defense had chosen it. Inside, behind 2 sets of reinforced iron doors, sat 32 massive safes, each nearly 3 meters tall, containing the most sensitive documents in the history of Iran's nuclear program. The complete archive of the AMAD project, blueprints, production plans, warhead designs, records of secret tests,
the full, documented history of Iran's military nuclear ambitions going back to 1999. Only a handful of people in Iran knew the archive existed at that location. The Mossad team knew. They knew which warehouse. They knew which safes contained the most critical material. They knew the security rotation, that the guards did not work around the clock, specifically to avoid drawing attention to the building's importance. The team had 6 hours and 29 minutes before the morning shift arrived. They used a jamming device to override the alarm system. They cut through the iron doors. They opened the safes. Not all 32, but the specific ones that held the most incriminating material, a selection that could only have been made with prior knowledge of the archive's contents. They took 100,000 documents and 183 compact discs, half a ton of material. And then they left Tehran the same night, splitting into multiple groups across different routes without a single member of the team being caught. When Iranian security forces arrived at 7 in the morning and discovered the break-in, they launched a manhunt involving thousands of personnel. It produced nothing. The material was already in Israel. 3 months later, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood before cameras in Tel Aviv and revealed the operation to the world, displaying documents that proved Iran had systematically lied to the international community about the military dimensions of its nuclear program.
Within days, then-President Donald Trump announced the withdrawal of the United States from the 2015 nuclear agreement. The theft of that archive did not just humiliate Iran. It reshaped the diplomatic landscape of the entire region. The operation was later given a name inside Mossad: Operation Stealing the Reality. It won Israel's highest intelligence prize, and its success depended, at its foundation, on human intelligence from inside the Iranian system. Intelligence that told Mossad not just that the archive existed, but where it was, what it contained, and exactly when and how it could be reached without triggering the security apparatus that surrounded it. The unit designed to find Mossad's agents had been telling Mossad which of its agents were safe and where the doors were left unlocked.
Nearly 3 years after the archive operation, on November 27, 2020, the consequences of that sustained penetration became even more visible. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the man Netanyahu had publicly identified in his archive presentation as the director of Iran's military nuclear program, the scientist whose handwriting appeared on documents ordering the concealment of Iran's weapons research, the figure that Western and Israeli intelligence had assessed as the single most important individual in Iran's nuclear establishment, was killed on a road outside Tehran in an operation of extraordinary technical and human complexity. The weapon used to kill Fakhrizadeh was a modified machine gun weighing approximately 1 ton, smuggled into Iran in components over a period of 8 months and assembled inside the country. It was mounted in a vehicle parked along the road where Fakhrizadeh's convoy would pass. It was operated remotely. The triggerman was outside Iran at the moment of the assassination. The weapon included a self-destruct mechanism designed to destroy evidence after the operation. The entire team involved, more than 20 people, including both Israeli operatives and Iranian nationals recruited to participate, had been running surveillance on Fakhrizadeh's movements for months before the strike. 8 months of preparation. A ton of equipment smuggled in pieces across international borders. Iranian citizens recruited and managed inside the country. All of this conducted without detection, in a security environment where the organization specifically tasked with detecting exactly this kind of operation was itself compromised from the top. Iran's intelligence minister at the time acknowledged that a member of Iran's own armed forces had been involved in the assassination. That admission, made on state television, confirmed what the operational complexity of the strike had already implied. Mossad had not simply tracked Fakhrizadeh from the outside. It had people inside. People who knew his schedule, his routes, his habits, and his security arrangements well enough to plan an operation that required 8 months of undetected presence on Iranian soil. Inside the IRGC, the Fakhrizadeh assassination produced a reaction that was simultaneously furious and deeply frightened. Furious because the target was among the most protected individuals in the Iranian system. Frightened because the operation had demonstrated beyond any remaining doubt that protection meant nothing if the people responsible for providing it were being watched by the enemy. The question was no longer whether Iran had been penetrated. The question was how far the penetration went, and whether the tools Iran was using to answer that question were themselves part of the problem. In 2021, that question got a partial answer. The unit commander was identified. The network was exposed. And before Iran could act, every member of it was gone. Iran declared victory. Senior officials announced the dismantling of the Israeli spy network as a landmark achievement. The language was triumphant. But underneath the official narrative, a far more uncomfortable reality was taking shape, one that no press release could address and no arrest could resolve. Because the escape of 21 people in the precise window between their identification and their arrest had required a warning. And the source of that warning had not been caught, had not been identified, was in all probability still in place, watching, reporting, and waiting. And within 4 years, the proof of that would arrive in a form that no Iranian official would ever be able to explain away. The proof arrived from the sky. In July of 2024, Iran's intelligence minister, Esmail Khatib, made a public announcement that was intended to project strength. The Mossad infiltration network, he declared, had been dismantled. The threat had been neutralized. The Islamic Republic's security services had done their job. He described it as the defining achievement of his ministry under the Ra'isi administration, the moment when Iran had finally closed the wound that had been bleeding for years. It was the worst possible moment to declare victory. Because while Khatib was speaking, Mossad was already several years deep into building the next generation of networks. Networks constructed with full knowledge of every method Iran used to detect them, every procedure it used to verify loyalty, every technical system it used to monitor its own personnel. The men who had escaped in 2021 had handed over not just intelligence files, but a complete operational blueprint of Iranian counterintelligence. And Mossad had spent 3 years studying that blueprint, finding every gap and building through every one of them. The results became visible in September of 2024, not through a single strike, but through a sequence of events so precisely orchestrated that they left no room for alternative explanations. On September 17, 2024, thousands of pagers belonging to Hezbollah operatives across Lebanon simultaneously exploded. The devices had been compromised during the manufacturing process itself. Miniaturized explosive charges embedded into the hardware before it ever reached Hezbollah's hands. The detonations killed dozens and wounded more than 3,000 people across 2 days of coordinated attacks, crippling Hezbollah's operational communications network in a single afternoon. The following day, the same operation extended to handheld radios. More explosions, more casualties, more confusion. This operation, the most sophisticated supply chain attack in the history of modern intelligence, had required years of preparation, penetration of international commercial networks, and the ability to move compromised hardware through multiple layers of Hezbollah's procurement system without detection. It was not an operation that could be improvised. It had been built patiently, invisibly, in the precise spaces where Iranian and Hezbollah counterintelligence had been assured there was nothing to find. 10 days later, on September 27th, Israeli Air Force jets delivered more than 80 heavy munitions onto Hezbollah's underground command headquarters in the Dahiya suburb of southern Beirut. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, the man who had led the organization for 32 years, who had survived every previous Israeli attempt to reach him, was killed, along with every senior commander present at the meeting. The reinforced concrete structure, built specifically to survive aerial bombardment, was driven into the earth. The French newspaper Le Parisien, citing a Lebanese source, reported that Israel had been informed of Nasrallah's presence in that specific location by an Iranian mole. Not a Lebanese source, an Iranian one. Someone inside the Iranian security apparatus, the apparatus that had just finished announcing the defeat of Mossad's penetration network 3 months earlier, had told Israel exactly where Nasrallah would be and exactly when he would be there. Inside Tehran, the immediate public response was controlled fury, statements of revenge, tributes to the fallen, the machinery of official mourning activated with practiced efficiency. But inside the IRGC's counterintelligence division, the reaction was not grief. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not produce a comfortable answer. Hania had been killed in July in a secured Tehran guest house, a building protected by IRGC security, in a room that a device had been placed in weeks or months before his arrival. Someone with access to that facility had known which room he would occupy.
Now Nasrallah had been killed at a meeting that, by every protocol Hezbollah operated under, should have been known to an absolute minimum number of people. And according to reporting from one of Europe's most established newspapers, the location had been passed to Israel by someone inside Iran. The chilling conclusion was unavoidable. The network that had been declared dismantled in July was not dismantled. The penetration that had been announced as defeated was not defeated. Mossad still had eyes inside the most sensitive layers of the Iranian security system. Eyes that had watched Hania arrive in Tehran. Eyes that had known where Nasrallah would shelter. Eyes that had been operating without interruption through every arrest, every purge, every announcement of victory. Former Intelligence Minister Ali Younesi, who had served under President Khatami and later as an advisor to President Rouhani, and who knew the structure of Iranian intelligence from the inside, had said in 2022 that Mossad had infiltrated so many government departments that all of Iran's top officials should fear for their lives. At the time, the statement had been treated as the dark hyperbole of a man speaking out of turn. By the autumn of 2024, it read as precise and literal description. Senior advisor to Khamenei, Ali Larijani, acknowledged in November of 2024 that the problem of infiltration had become very serious in recent years, and that there had been instances of negligence going back years. That acknowledgement, from one of the most senior figures in the Iranian system, a man not given to public admissions of weakness, was its own form of confirmation. The Islamic Republic knew it had a problem it could not solve. It did not know how deep the problem went, and it was about to find out. On the morning of June 13th, 2025, Israel launched what would become known as Operation Rising Lion, a coordinated strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its air defense systems, its ballistic missile arsenal, and its military command structure. The operation was the largest single intelligence and military action ever conducted against Iran, and its execution revealed in granular operational detail the full depth of what Mossad had built inside the country over the previous decade. Before a single Israeli aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace, teams of agents recruited by Mossad and operating inside Iran destroyed anti-aircraft batteries from the ground. A ProPublica investigation published afterward described how roughly 70 commandos, Iranian nationals and others recruited from neighboring countries, had positioned themselves near carefully selected air defense targets on the night of June 12th. At 3 a.m. on June 13th, they opened fire with drones and missiles on a list of batteries that covered the approaches to Tehran. Every single battery on Mossad's list was destroyed, 100%, in areas where Israeli aircraft had never previously operated. The operation did not stop there. Israeli cyber warriors sent a fabricated message to senior Iranian military leaders, directing them to an emergency meeting in an underground bunker. The bunker was then struck by a precision munition.
Dozens of senior military figures were killed. The message had been convincing enough, specific enough, credible enough in its framing and its apparent origin, that Iran's most senior commanders had followed it to their deaths. Israeli intelligence had also identified the precise locations where Iranian nuclear scientists were sleeping. Not their offices, not their laboratories, their bedrooms. Airstrikes targeted those locations directly. The level of human intelligence required to produce that kind of targeting, the sustained, patient cultivation of sources with access not just to professional schedules, but to the private domestic routines of protected individuals, was not something that could be assembled in months. It had been built over years, through networks that Iranian counterintelligence had spent years and significant institutional resources trying to find and had never found, because the people tasked with finding them had spent years pointing the search in the wrong direction.
After the strikes, Iran arrested scores of people on espionage charges. It executed at least 2 individuals convicted of cooperating with Mossad. It ordered senior officials to stop using internet-connected smartphones. It asked members of the public to report any buildings rented to unfamiliar companies or individuals in the previous 2 years. The Islamic Republic was conducting, in public, the kind of desperate security sweep that intelligence services conduct when they have lost control of their own perimeter and do not know where the holes are. Mossad director David Barnea, speaking at an award ceremony after the June strikes, stated that Israel had very strong operational capabilities inside Iran and that the Mossad was not letting up. Not a warning about the future, a description of the present. In Tehran, that statement landed in rooms full of people who had spent years telling themselves and each other that the penetration problem had been solved. Rooms full of people who had believed the announcements, trusted the arrests, accepted the declarations of victory. Those rooms were now very quiet. And the question that was being asked in those rooms, quietly, carefully, with the particular caution of people who understood that asking the wrong question too loudly could itself become dangerous, was not about June of 2025. It was about something much older. Something that had been there from the beginning. Something that might still be there now. What followed from that silence was not action. It was the particular paralysis of a system that has begun to suspect it cannot trust its own ability to investigate itself. Every new probe into penetration required trusting someone with access to the investigation. Every new counterintelligence review required someone to lead it, and the history of the past decade had made one thing very clear. The person appointed to that role was the most dangerous appointment the Islamic Republic could make. The question was not new. It had been sitting at the edge of every internal Iranian security review for the better part of a decade. But it had never been asked with this degree of urgency, this weight of accumulated evidence, this particular combination of recent disasters pressing down on every conversation. The question was simple. If the unit built to find Mossad's agents was itself run by a Mossad agent, and if that agent escaped with a complete map of Iranian counterintelligence methods, then what exactly had the replacements built in his wake? The new unit, the new leadership, the new procedures designed to correct the failures of the old ones. All of it had been constructed by people who did not know what had been handed to the enemy. All of it had been built inside a system whose fundamental vulnerability had not been addressed, because the people responsible for addressing it did not fully understand what had been lost. There is a principle in intelligence work that analysts call the second-order problem. It is not enough to know that your system has been penetrated. You have to know what the penetration gave the other side, because that determines not just what they know, but what they can do next, how they can predict your countermeasures, how they can remain invisible while you believe you are searching effectively. The second-order problem of the anti-Mossad unit was this. The man who ran it had not simply passed intelligence files to Israel. He had passed Iran's entire counterintelligence methodology, which meant that every new system Iran built to replace him
was built inside a framework that Israel already understood completely.
This is what made the declaration of victory in 2024 so catastrophic in retrospect. It was not simply premature. It was structurally impossible. Iran could not have solved the penetration problem by removing the 21 men who were identified, because the knowledge those men had carried out had already been used to build the next generation of agents. Agents operating not through the same channels that had been exposed, but through entirely new ones, built specifically to avoid every detection method Iran possessed. Methods that Mossad now understood better than many of the Iranian officials responsible for applying them. The events of June 2025 had proven this beyond any institutional capacity for denial. The ground teams that destroyed Iran's air defenses from the inside, the fake message that sent senior commanders to their deaths in a phantom bunker. The airstrikes on the precise bedrooms of nuclear scientists whose home addresses should have been among the most protected personal information in the Islamic Republic. None of this was possible without sustained, deeply embedded human intelligence that had been running quietly and invisibly through every round of announced victories and declared defeats. And then came February 28, 2026. The compound on Pasteur Street, the Ramadan Summit. Khamenei and his entire National Security Council in one building at one moment, in a gathering whose existence and composition and precise timing was known, according to every account that has emerged in the weeks since, to an extremely limited number of people within the Iranian system. The kind of information that does not travel through broad institutional channels. The kind of information that passes through the specific, restricted layer of the system, where the most sensitive operational details are handled. The same layer where, years earlier, a man whose name has never been published had sat at the top of the structure designed to protect exactly this kind of information from the enemy. More than 30 precision munitions struck the compound. The collapse was total. In 60 minutes, the Islamic Republic lost its supreme leader, its senior military commanders, and the coherent command structure that had held the system together for 47 years. The operation required knowing not just that the summit was happening, but its exact location, its precise timing, and the confirmation that every target would be present at the moment of the strike. The margin for error in that kind of operation is zero. The intelligence that enables it does not come from signals collection or satellite imagery alone. It comes from a human source with direct access to the planning and the people. In the days following the strike, as the surviving fragments of the Iranian state struggled to establish who was in charge and what had just happened, a former intelligence minister who had served under President Khatami and later as an advisor to President Rouhani offered the assessment that Mossad had infiltrated so many government departments over the preceding decade that distinguishing genuine loyalty from Israeli penetration had become nearly impossible. That assessment, made nearly 4 years earlier as a warning, now read as an autopsy. A senior Iranian official, speaking to a British newspaper in November of 2025, before the February strike, but after the June strikes, had said that trust had become the central problem inside the system. Not competence, not resources. Trust. The growing number of people who were, in one way or another, working for the other side had created a condition in which officials could not be certain that any investigation into penetration was not itself being monitored by the penetration it was investigating. It was a closed loop. A system that could not audit itself because the audit was compromised. The man who had created the conditions for that closed loop, the unnamed commander of the anti-Mossad unit, had been living in Israel for 5 years by the time the February strike occurred. His name remains unpublished. His face has not appeared in any news report. He has given no interviews. He is, in the vocabulary of intelligence services, a protected source, which means he is still considered valuable, which means what he knows is still considered actionable, which means the knowledge he carried out of Iran in 2021 has not yet been fully expended. Iran, for its part, has said almost nothing. Not about the February strike in terms that explain the intelligence failure it represents. Not about the identity of the unit commander. Not about the full scope of what was lost when 21 people walked out of the country with the map of Iran's counterintelligence architecture in their heads. The silence is not accidental. It is the silence of an institution that understands at some level that a full public accounting of what happened would require explaining not just individual failures, but a systemic vulnerability that persists, that cannot be resolved by arrests or executions or announcements of victory, because its roots go back to a decision made years ago about who to trust with the most sensitive assignment in the Iranian security system. That decision produced a man whose name nobody will say, a man who built his career inside an apparatus designed to protect Iran from exactly the kind of penetration he was conducting. A man who, when the moment came, walked out and took with him not just files, not just names, not just operational details, but the entire conceptual architecture of how Iran sees the enemy within, the full picture of its own blindness. New units have been formed, new commanders have been appointed, new procedures have been written. Somewhere inside the current structure of Iranian counterintelligence, a new person sits in the chair that the unnamed commander once occupied. A person with the same access, the same visibility, the same knowledge of every method, every channel, every weakness that the system uses to protect itself. And in the rooms where these things are discussed, carefully, quietly, with the particular exhaustion of people who have been through this before, the question that nobody wants to ask out loud is the only question that actually matters. How do they know it is not happening again? They do not. That is the answer that the Islamic Republic has been unable to escape since 2021, and that the events of 2024 and 25 and February 28, 2026 have made impossible to ignore. The wound that Ahmadinejad described in an October evening interview, speaking carefully on camera about a failure that Iranian officials were still silent about, was not a wound that had healed. It was a wound that had never been properly examined, because the instruments available for examining it were themselves part of the injury. The hunters built a unit to catch the hunted. The hunted ran the unit. And everything that has followed, every operation, every strike, every name that has not come home, flows from that single, foundational, irreversible fact.